Good to see you all. My name is Raphael Bostic. I'm the director of the Bedrosian Center on Governance and the Public Enterprise. Welcome to our latest installation of Road to the White House. We are almost at the end of the road, and we've been talking about this for a couple of semesters now, and things are starting to shape up as the horse race that everybody expected it to be. I'm guessing most of you saw the debate last night. There was a lot there, and that was wide-ranging in terms of the topics. It's actually quite interesting that there was some time spent on education and the important role that that played, which was the topic of last week's Road to the White House session. Hope you saw that. It was a really good conversation about the issues that we are dealing with. This is a series, just as a reminder, that is jointly run by three parts of the school, three parts of the university. My center is in the Price School of Public Policy, and we do this jointly with the Jesse Unruh Institute of Politics, which is in the Dornside College, and the Annenberg Center on Communication, Leadership, and Policy, which is in the Annenberg School. And it does represent an intersectoral engagement that I think reflects all the good things about being in the university, bringing together expertise on a particular topic that allows us to cover a much broader array of issues and in a deeper way, so that's really good. We are the ones who are organizing the topic for today, which is the environment, and the topic title is one of the most important non-issues of the campaign, climate change, and it is quite interesting that we have heard very, very little about climate change directly as an issue worthy of a policy discussion. So today we're actually going to have some reflection on that and some discussion about the policies themselves. I can actually think of nobody better on campus to lead this discussion than Professor Dan Mazmanian. Dan is someone who is really close to my life, because he was the dean of the Price School when it was the School of Policy, Planning, and Development, and hired me. So I am actually
one of his very good moves.
I'm actually very much indebted to Dan and his wise decision making in terms of staffing. Right now, and Dan also was the founding director of the Bedrosian Center, and actually was the me for the first part of this Road to the White House series, so you may remember seeing him in a bunch of other contexts. Right now, he is the director of new initiatives at the Center for Sustainable Cities, so he's really tied into a lot of the sustainability issue. He is, you might say, famous when it comes to sustainability. He serves as the executive director for a report of the California Adaptation Advisory Panel. So well known at the state level and is a leader in terms of thinking that, but not just at the state level. He is serving on the task force on environmental governance of the China Council for International Cooperation on Environment and Development. So we've actually gone global in terms of these issues, and Dan is very much in the middle of all of those discussions. He's going to lead the panel, so I'm going to turn it over to him. But I want to thank all of you for coming, and I also especially want to thank our panelists for agreeing to talk. So thank you and enjoy.
Thank you very much, Raphael.
Welcome to everybody. Let me give you just a little outline of how we're going to follow the process today. We're going to have some self-introductions, but I've asked Juliana Wang if she would be kind enough to give us a little backdrop on the science of climate change and why it matters, or why scientists think it should matter. Now, I'm going to use this as an opportunity to do a little education. I don't want to insult any of you who know all about California and California climate change, but a few high points on what California has already adopted as a climate change strategy to give some context, and we'll look at that. And then we actually, of course, as you can see, this is about the election, so we've asked two representatives to speak on the part of the Democratic perspective and the Republican perspective on this issue, and that's going to be Alex and Charles. We'll hear from them also, but we'll try and kind of what the science is, what the California policy is, talk about why we are or are not developing this as a national policy, have Q&A, Hopefully we can wrap all these up and everybody will go away knowing exactly why it's a non-issue. But I would hopefully think you'll also believe it's an important one that should be an issue. With that said, I'm going to turn it over to Juliana to start, Dr. Juliana Wang. I asked each of them a little bit about their background so you'll know about them, and then about the science of this issue. Juliana, please.
Great, thank you. Thank you for having me here. So I'm Juliana Wang. I'm an assistant professor of the practice in the environmental studies program, part of the Dornsife College. And I teach a couple courses on the economics of natural resources and environment, on green business, environmental law and policy. And this semester I actually just started a course on water and energy management in China from the perspective of market forces and the socialist traditions. So today I was asked to speak a little bit about the science of climate change. And I thought I would start with the history of a couple of important international organizations. So that is IPCC, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and then the UNFCCC, so United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. So the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, is a body of scientists. It was started back in the late 80s, in 1988, at the initiation of two other international organizations. One is the World Meteorological Organization, and the other is the UNEP, United Nations Environment Program, to really look into what is going on with our climate. So 2 years later, in 1990, they issued their first assessment report with the current, back then, the understandings of where things are. And it was important enough to prompt the creation of UNFCCC in 1990. So this new United Nations organization that's in charge of coordinating all the nations on the policy front. So the science organization informing policy. And then later on, subsequently in 1995, 2 years before the famous Kyoto Protocol in Japan, in 1997, they issued their second assessment report. And then 2001, the third assessment report. And the most famous one so far and the latest is the fourth assessment report in 2007. And that's also what called a lot of attention to IPCC and their assessment reports, and they also received the Nobel Peace Prize that year, if you remember. Right, so now the IPCC is working on their fifth assessment report. It's due, I think, May next year, 2013, and some of the drafts are already available online. So if you're interested in looking into that, go to their website, ipcc.ch. And within the IPCC, they have a couple working groups, just the way they organize themselves. Before I go to the specific science and the findings, they have a working group 1 that's in charge of the basic physical science of climate change. And working group 2 that's in charge of vulnerability studies and adaptation. And working group 3 is in charge of mitigation. And then they also have a task force that's in charge of helping each country to figure out their inventory. So without the inventory, we don't really have a baseline without which there's no basis for any policy. So then I want to move on to talk a little bit about the causes, the effects, and the uncertainties of climate change and the need for policy. So the causes of climate change, as scientists understand it right now, is there's a group of gases that trap heat from escaping from the Earth. So we have radiation from the sun that comes to the Earth, and some of the radiation reflects back to space. And there's a group of gases that's called the greenhouse gases that trap the radiation, the heat from going back into space. And some of these gases are considered to be forcing, so they don't really interact physically or chemically very much. So carbon dioxide is one of them. So their lifespan is very long once it's emitted into the atmosphere. There are also what is called these feedbacks. So water vapor is actually also a greenhouse gas, but it does interact physically and chemically, with temperature, et cetera, they form into clouds. So they are considered feedbacks. So these are, the effects are more short term, or they work on top of these forcing that I just mentioned. So what are some of the effects that we've observed so far? First of all, temperature, right? People often call climate change global warming. So on average, the models predict that the global surface temperature is going to rise and has been rising. But of course, that doesn't mean it will happen everywhere. So there will be regional heterogeneities or just differences, right? The second effect has to do with precipitation. With warming temperature on average, we'll see that on average, there will be more precipitation around the globe. And again, it varies from region to region. Some regions are actually going to be drier. And then the third impact is sea level rise, right? So this year, right, I think we saw the sea ice in the Arctic actually reached a new low. And with temperature rising, the ocean currents are going to be affected, and a lot of the low-lying island countries are going to be most vulnerable to this effect. And the last effect is on agriculture, which is also essential to our well-being. So certain, again, because certain parts are going to be warmer, certain parts are going to be cooler, and changing precipitation, agriculture output is and pattern is going to change. So those are the 4 categories of effects of climate change. And lastly, I just want to mention uncertainty. There's still a lot of uncertainty with regard to the specific outcome, especially with regard to the low probability but high impact extreme weather events. So I think a lot of need to continue with scientific research, and also in climate modeling to look at the regional level and even local level to really be able to accurately predict what is going to happen. And that will better inform our policy decisions and our actions. So I think I'll stop here.
I think that's a wonderful introduction to a very complicated issue, and gives a timeline as well as why this is believed by scientists, climate scientists, to be quite serious. And this is the international now set of climate scientists. So I'm going to step in a little bit about, well, so what is California doing about that? And these models that Juliana mentioned are global, but they're also being scaled down to region, and even now in California, even within regions like Los Angeles. But in any event, these models that look at this region, as in the West, for instance, the Western United States, suggest that there is going to be significant changes in precipitation in California. How many here are from California? How many have been skiing in California? Several. All right, well, we're going to have, the projections are up to 80% less snowfall in the High Sierra than we have today by the end of the century. That's a projection, but that will have a dramatic effect on the availability of water to Californians, because we get right now 25% of our usable potable water off the snowpack. That doesn't mean we're not going to get as much water as in rain, but not as in snow. Sea level rise, another issue that the projections suggest are going to be quite serious for Californians, and they range quite dramatically in terms of those projections. There is uncertainty and variability, but it could be up to 6 feet high along the California coast by the end of the century. California is already planning in some areas for development a 55-inch sea level rise in order to develop any infrastructure that might be exposed. The state's already doing that. There's the forestry. Clearly, changing temperatures are going to affect agriculture, and especially, agriculture, especially forestry, where we may well be finding ourselves in extraordinary situations with fires in the extensive forests, particularly in Northern California. There are other possible ramifications for which we have less certainty, but some strong feelings. One has to do with health and health vectors, changing nature of disease, transmittable diseases, and infections and so forth that may follow from elevated heat or variable heat in changes. So a lot of projections about what might happen in California. California has responded. In fact, political leaders in California and many of the researchers, both in the state and around the globe, see California as leading the United States in promulgating a strategy, a climate change policy. And that policy is intended to do really two things. One is substantially reduce the level of greenhouse gas emissions coming from California, and also doing so in a way that inspires, if you will, and encourages the coordination across the western states, and in fact sets a template for what the United States might be doing in terms of its response to climate change. At least that's the hope in California. Now, the effort and the beliefs by the state policymakers is important to the state politically. You may have heard about our climate change policy. It's important economically and environmentally. And all of this was dramatically underscored by what is called the Global Warming Solutions. Catch that, we have a solution in California. The Global Warming Solutions Act of 2006, signed by our past governor, Arnold Schwarzenegger, and passed by our Democratic state legislature. And the bill was the first state-level statute in the United States calling for a comprehensive response to greenhouse gas emissions. And that has put California on the forefront of not only the policy discussion, but the discussion that I think will come out when we talk about the partisan positions on this, something about the science policy nexus, we call it. To what extent is the science believable, credible, reliable, and what is the policy response or what it might be? So let me very briefly, a little bit here. AB 32, which is the Global Warming Solutions Act, was enacted in 2006, but it's only now phasing in. It's been incrementally phasing in. A key part of it, which you're going to hear about called the cap and trade, is only now being rolled out, and that's to deal with this issue. But what are its goals? The goals are actually quite significant. They feed off of the IPCC report and recommendation that we all work around the globe, not just in California, to keep the climate change, the elevation in temperature, to no more than 2 degrees by the year 2050. So California began with how we're going to do that in California, and what's our share of the greenhouse gas emissions that need to be reduced if we're going to be able to do that. And the answer is the following, that the goal for doing so calls for reducing our greenhouse gas emissions in California by down to the 1990 level. We're in 2012 now, back down to 1990 level by 2020. And that's actually what the act calls for. And then the governor and the Public Utilities Commission and others have all said, and that's just the beginning. In order to actually meet the IPCC goals for reducing greenhouse gas emissions, California's going to have to reduce its greenhouse gas emissions by another 80% by 2050. That's a huge challenge. How is it going to do so? The policy says we're all involved. None of us in this room, no Californian is going to evade participating in this greenhouse gas reductions, but you won't know about it most of the time. You'll feel it in your pocketbook, you will feel it in your transportation, you may feel it in your communities, but it's going to be played out through several dimensions. It's going to be played out through changing our transportation strategy away from fossil fuels to electric and hybrid vehicles and other transportations. In fact, right in California alone, our South Coast Air Quality Management District is pushing for zero emissions freight movement for the entire region. Through power generation. I don't know, does anybody here know where USC gets its electricity from? What is the provider for us? Anybody know? Pardon me? No, that's a location. Who transmits electricity to us?
The Southern California Institute Department of Water and Power.
Wrong. I only had to do that because it's Bonnie, but she's new to the community. No, we're part of the city of Los Angeles. We have a contract with the city of Los Angeles. When this discussion began, Los Angeles was getting 55% of its electricity from coal-burning fire fuel plants outside of California, bringing them on lines. Today, that's down to 20%, and it's going to zero from coal-burning plants from outside the state. You can't burn them inside the state. So Los Angeles is making a major effort to move from coal to gas to alternative fuels. All the regulated utilities and communities that have their municipal facilities, municipal plants in California, have to have a 33% alternative energy mix in their mix of electricity in California as we go forward. A huge issue. So they have to deal with transportation, moving out of fossil fuel burning cars, power generation, huge amount of it being alternative energy. Manufacturing and industry has to have a portion. We're going to change building standards and urban design, another way of dealing with this issue about emissions, because when we live in a sprawled arena, of course we travel further, it costs more to get there, we use more energy, we have to live more compactly. And then forestry and agriculture have to contribute their part to reducing emissions. California has the most comprehensive plan of any state in the United States for reducing its greenhouse gas emissions. We're all participating in it, whether you want to or not. And this has raised a number of questions about why California is doing it, can it achieve its goals, and how intelligent is it for us to be doing so. And I'm going to go over those quickly to open up the conversation. First of all, AB 32 is the first state-level, economy-wide approach in the United States, establishing a cap on greenhouse gas emissions for the entire state and asking everyone, just about everyone, to share in that reduction strategy through our efforts, through industry's efforts, through cities' efforts, through the utilities' efforts, through the automotive industry's efforts. So this is a collective effort like nothing seen elsewhere. Most of the other states go after their electricity generating facilities and almost that alone. Some for their automobiles. But California says, no, this is so big we all have to be part of it. The policy calls for cap and trade, which I think we're going to hear about a little bit, which allows regulated industries in the state to achieve a reduction, not simply by modifying their own technology, their production processes, and what they manufacture and sell, although that's part of it. It says, if you can cut a deal with someone else who's emitting and purchase their rights to pollute, yes, this involves rights to pollute, to emit greenhouse gases, if you can purchase them from them cheaper than changing your own facility, you may do so. That's called the cap, we have at lab, and then trade those emissions rights. And so basically the idea is to create a market to reduce the cost across the board for industry to accomplish the goals we've set for industry to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. Very controversial. The legislation includes mandatory rules for reporting greenhouse gas emissions. The inventory that Juliana talked about, all major emitters in California now have to monitor and report their emissions of greenhouse gases. That's a significant regulatory requirement, and it's enforceable with penalties for noncompliance if you're caught cheating. Okay. Interestingly enough, for those of us in the university who always talk about the importance of transparency and monitoring and seeing policy evolve, the California Environmental Protection Agency, called Cal-EPA, is required to provide an annual report that you can find online on their website and benchmarks for developing the regulations across all these sectors and how well they're performing. So we actually have access as citizens to see how well the state is performing in reducing its emissions. Another major issue, you can imagine the difficulties involved, that we've asked Cal-EPA to monitor the actual behavior of the state in reducing our greenhouse gas emissions. I mentioned, but I'll just reiterate it, the plan emphasizes energy. that is the generation of energy, electric energy in particular in the state, a huge contributor to our greenhouse gas emissions. And through what's called a renewable portfolio standard, that means that they have to show over time how they're going to move away from fossil fuel burning energy generating facilities to non-fossil fuel energy generating, or show how in fact they've contributed to the reduction of need for energy. And so that takes us to things like nuclear power, hydroelectric power, solar power, wind power, getting out of your car power, using less energy in your house power, turning off the lights power, ways of reducing energy consumption, which reduces the generation of it. So that's California's policy. So now I've told you this, you've heard the science, you've heard California, the purpose of we're here today. Why isn't this being discussed as a national strategy? If the issue is so serious, as Juliana has suggested science tells us, and I'm telling you, we already have a model, it's right here in California, we are the leaders, why is nobody paying attention? To start this conversation, then, I'm going to turn to our two student speakers. I'm going to start over here with Charles Epting. Charles, a little bit about yourself, who you're representing here, and why aren't we doing this nationally? Where is this in the election discussion? Go ahead.
My name is Charles Epting. I'm a sophomore at USC. I'm an environmental studies and geology double major, and I'm here to represent the USC College Republicans and the greater Republican Party platform as well. I think the reason it's not being, I think it is being discussed, it's just hidden. I think in the past couple of election cycles, going back to especially Al Gore's participation, I think that it's become sort of an issue that people expect to hear about. And I think, frankly, people have gotten tired about hearing about climate change and global warming openly. And I think the candidates know that. I think they know it sounds like a dated topic for conversation, so they're starting to hide it more. They're starting to talk about it under the auspices of alternative energies, under cap and trade. I think that I think the same essential issues are being discussed. They just aren't coming out and using the words climate change or global warming. I think that they're sort of tiptoeing around the issue so that people don't think that it's just the same issue that's been rehashed for the past couple of election cycles.
Charles, before we go on, that's a plausible explanation, but they're talking about education, and I'm a little older than you, and they've been talking about education since I was in diapers. They're talking about the economy, not a new issue. They've been talking about that since at least, the 1960s. There are a lot of issues that are going around. This one isn't, though. I think that there's got to be something a little bit more than people have heard all there is to hear. But I don't know. That's just a reflection on that.
Well, I think issues like the economy and education are more pressing, more imminent.
That may be the point.
I was going to say, if you can't put food on your table for your family tonight, that's more of a direct issue than something that's 100 years out, 200 years out, something that's not as tangible.
Okay.
And that's another...
No, it may be. It may be it's over the horizon. It's not,
Right.
as you say, as
Right.
tangible. It's not as visible, and it's not as pressing for some people today. That's at least possible. Let's turn here to Alex Blow. And Alex, please introduce yourself and your perspective on this, or the Democratic Party perspective on this.
Sure. My name is Alex Blow. I'm a junior international relations major and with a minor in econ. And I'm here on behalf of the College Democrats. I think some interesting points were made by Charles here. I do think that they're focusing heavily on the economy. I've often been amazed about how people forget how close we were to a financial disaster. I mean, we saw one happen, but we really almost saw the capitalism end as we know it. So coming back from that is obviously a very difficult thing to do. That's what people are most focused on. So I think that's one explanation. The other thing is we actually have heard about climate change. And two examples come to mind, and they were both during the convention speeches. Obama specifically mentioned climate change on a global scale and mentioned the need to combat it. Now, I think he hasn't really specifically addressed it since then, and I'm one of the people who's very mad about that. But you notice the difference between his statements and Romney's statements. Romney basically turned it into, I don't think it's unfair to say, a joke, saying Obama wants to slow the rise of the oceans, obviously referring to climate change. pause for a huge laugh from his audience. So I think the two different, our political system is very polarized right now, but I think the two different parties have different reasons for not discussing it. And they do tiptoe around the issues. They have all the important parts there. They just don't kind of bring them together, and I hope to come back to that statement later on. But the Republican Party basically doesn't mention it because they have a base who wholeheartedly disavows climate change. Either climate change is actually happening or that climate change is anthropogenic or man-made. They disavow the UN, which would mean they disavow the UN FCCC. And it kind of cuts right to the core of policy for climate change because this is a global issue. And if you have a base or a mentality, which the Republican Party has had for a long time, I'm not trying to bash them, it's just part of their platform that the UN, us being subjected to any sort of international constraints, is unacceptable. That's going to have to end if we want to do anything about climate change because it's a global problem and requires global solutions. There's a lot more to be said on intergovernmental cooperation, but as far as the Democratic Party go, I think Charles nailed it. I think we're just focusing on the economy. They talk about energy independence. That's an important part of climate change, but again, one of the pieces, they didn't connect the whole picture. But yeah, I think it's just really they're prioritizing other issues right now. And I do kind of feel like the undecided voter doesn't really care about climate change. It's not on their mind. And so for a candidate to spend time on it, especially in the United States, which has a very different political culture from other developed nations regarding climate change, it can be easy for certain pundits in the media to spin it off as, why is he focusing on this when he should be focusing on jobs? And I think that gives a lot of reason for Obama and the Democratic Party to kind of back off using the term climate change, but not talking about the components that go into making it up. So,
A lot of questions here, but Charles, you want to respond at all?
No, I agree completely. I do think that it is a matter of they don't want to, time is so precious in these last couple of weeks leading up to the election. I feel like neither party wants to focus on something that isn't being asked about. The media has not pressed the issue at all. And I don't see them voluntarily bringing it up when there are other issues that need to be tackled.
Of course, Mother Nature is not waiting for the election. But while we do wait for the election, I have some questions for the audience and then some for the panel also. But let me just start with the questions. Just get some sense of where you stand on this or how you feel about this. First of all, a show of hands, please. Do you believe that climate is warming at an accelerating rate, at least over the period of recorded, human history? Do you believe that this is an accelerator rate, not just warming, because it's always warming? So any of you not believe that it is warming at an accelerating rate?
I have an advantage here. I'm happy about that.
What's that?
I said I have an advantage here.
How's that?
Never mind.
Okay. Anybody neutral on this, or just feel you don't know? So it's interesting. It's for all those you raise your hands, and no one said they were neutral or didn't know. There is a sense that the science is accurate. That is, the climate is changing at an accelerating rate, which means the models that are likely to foretell our future may be correct in terms of temperature. Let me just clarify that a little bit, because saying that they're correct on their temperature doesn't mean they're going to be correct on their effects on Los Angeles. That's a much different scale from the global temperature to the local regional variation. Another question, which goes to this. Do you believe that the burning of fossil fuels and other greenhouse gases released into the atmosphere as the result of human activity is the cause of this? How many of you believe it is the cause? I think we're preaching to the choir here. Anybody who thinks it's other reasons? There are other reasons why this could be happening. There is a long-term cycle of temperature rise and decline on the planet. Of course, it's over the level more than a human lifespan. It's over the 10,000, 100,000 year cycle. Do you believe that a policy to curb the release of greenhouse gases and the CO2 and other greenhouse gases is needed by the United States. Is needed by the United States, a national policy on reducing greenhouse gases. Do we need one? Say once again, it's interesting, it's interesting. That's a context, so let me turn back to the panel then and ask them some questions about this. So according to public opinion polls, we have an atypical group here today. According to public opinion polls, not everyone in the United States, in some polls up to 40% of the public nationally, and to a lesser degree, a significant number of Californians don't accept the IPCC report and the conclusion about the causes and the consequences of climate change. So they're not like those of us, by and large, in the room. Nevertheless, that's what public opinion polls show us. In fact, they show us, if you track the California poll, not the national, which is conducted by the California Policy Institute up in San Francisco, Public Policy Institute, that while 75% of Californians believe that climate change is real, the number of Californians who believe it's a very serious issue that implies you need to deal with it has actually been declining since 2008, when it was at a peak at about 54% of Californians, down to about 45% of Californians who believe we have to act on it. The problem, of course, is as every year goes by, without acting on it, we are emitting more and more greenhouse gases around the globe. You may not know this, but the United States has actually reduced its greenhouse gas emissions over the last couple of years. And there are two explanations for that. It is not about climate change policy. One is about the recession, where we use less energy, and two, it's about fracking. Anybody know what fracking is? It's the release of natural gas in old either oil or natural gas mines. And so the energy sector in the United States is rapidly shifting from coal over to natural gas as a matter of economics and pressure, political pressure about climate change. So actually, in aggregate, the United States has reduced its greenhouse gas emissions. It had been number one 5 years ago, with China following. China surpassed us. Now in terms of the global greenhouse gas emissions, 29% come from China, of the globes, and 16 from the United States. So we're changing, but not because of policy per se, about these other things, about technology and gas. That's just a sidebar about releases. Do you believe that the United States should act on its own, unilaterally, as California has done within the United States, as opposed to waiting for everyone else? Those who believe we should act unilaterally. I see some hands up, but not as many as the others. It's about a 50-50 split there, which is a panel. This is a tough one. And let me ask the panel, but we'll then turn it open to some questions and see if we can get to it. I'm curious, why is this? Which is, why is it that, and by the way, that comment, even that number was a large number that thought we should act unilaterally on this. And here's my question to the panelists to reflect on and comment. Do you think it's because of the quality of the science and the uncertainty about the science that we're not willing to act unilaterally? Is it about the disinclination of those who are going to be affected to face the consequences if the science is right? Another little factoid, in the United States, we consume about 20 to 25% of the globe's resources. We're only 5% of the globe's population. So there may be a disinclination of Americans to say, you know, I'm really not too excited about changing my lifestyle for someone 5,000 miles away and 50 years out. Maybe so. So it could be that. Is it because the issue has become politicized by self-interest, commercial and business interests, which I hear a lot about? Is it because it has been politicized for partisan gain? I mean, why is it that we're not moving forward as a society? Who wants to take a crack at this on the panel here?
I'll go ahead.
Go ahead.
I think a lot of it is uncertainty about the predictions that are being put forward by different scientific organizations. The estimates for temperatures 100 years in the future vary by up to 600%, depending on which study you look at. And in any other industry, if there was a 600% degree of uncertainty, you'd never trust that that organization. If a contractor said he could build a house for between $1 and $6 million, you'd never hire that contractor because that degree of uncertainty is unacceptable in today's society. And I think when I think people know that deep down we don't know what's going to happen. There is no consensus. There has never been a consensus on climate change. Does it look like things are trending upwards? Yes, but a new study or news report came out 2 days ago that said that we've plateaued in the past 16 years. We don't know what's going on, and I think people deep down can sense that. I think the American people are smart. I think they can see that while some people claim to have all the answers, no one has all the answers. We don't know what things are going to be like a week from now, let alone 100 years from now. So I think people are wary to start spending billions of dollars on policies that may or may not be about an issue that's actually as pressing as some people claim it is.
Alex?
Yeah, well, I actually was reading a report from the Proceedings of National Academy of Sciences, and we can argue what the public believes, but I think we really need to ask what the climatologists believe. They're the ones who spend their lives studying this stuff, and to kind of just disown their findings, for most of the public to disown their findings just on the basis of, a whim, is kind of insulting, I feel like. At least if I was a climatologist, I'd be a little bit insulted. But anyways, their study called Expert Credibility in Climate Change said that 97 to 98% of climate researchers most actively publishing peer-reviewed studies in the field support the tenets of anthropogenic climate change. And I actually wanted to ask this, you could respond after my answer, but according to the IPCC, I think the debate is, not whether we're going to see consequences or we're not going to see consequences. I think the debate is it going to be bad or is it going to be catastrophic? I think most scientists have kind of come to that conclusion. It's just, the varying degrees of how badly it's going to affect us in terms of all the different categories that were laid out earlier. Agriculture being a very, very sensitive industry in the United States. If we're wrong about what the effects are going to be, you might see an entire section of the population in the Midwest just be out of luck. And the other thing that kind of gets me about this is, there's uncertainty about the consequences, but we only have one planet. We don't get to run tests on other planets to see what would happen. I don't know about you, but if you want to wait around and see, that's your choice. But just know that we're the ones, and not us alone, us, India, China, major industrialized countries, we're the ones who are creating the problem. And there is a problem. I think that's pretty clear now. It's not a debate among the scientific community that there is a problem. We're changing the concentration of our atmosphere, which is something that we would have never even believed we could do. And it's really not us who are going to see the biggest consequences from it. It's going to be the smaller developing nations. But to answer the question he asked, no, I don't think it's because of the science. I think it's the politicalization, if that's the right word. But basically, everything's polarized now, as I said earlier. I feel like special interests are too heavily involved, but that's another conversation for another day. But if you really think that oil companies, who basically, because of this research, realize they're going to be pushed out of business. That's the goal, right, with climate change. It's not only that we want to just invest in renewable energy, which we do. That could be a separate, separate goal. But because of climate change, we have to. And they know that their industry is going to become the outdated industry. And in my opinion, you're naive if you don't think they're going to fight tooth and nail to make sure that doesn't happen. But I do think it's the politics of it. I think a lot of this uncertainty of the science is a consequence of that. The media focuses on skeptical scientists because they draw a lot of viewers. So I think it's just
Let's turn it out to the Q&A and see where we go from there. There's other points too, but questions, comments? The audience, it's your chance. Yes, introduce yourself, please.
Hi, my name is Sydney Fishman. I'm a freshman, and I'm an environmental studies major. And I wanted to pose this question because I actually wrote about this a couple weeks ago for one of my classes. On September 27th, the public PPP, forgot what it's. Huh?
Public Policy Institute of California.
No, PPP, like the polling organization,
That's the one.
came out with a poll of 8 swing states saying that both undecided and likely voters heavily favor presidential and congressional candidates who support a variety of environmental measures, such as reducing mercury and carbon toxicity and pollution, and also raising clean emission standards. And I was just wondering specifically, Alexander and Charles, what you thought about that, because you both claimed that the public is not really interested in these kinds of policies.
I'm very happy to hear that. But it wasn't so much that I don't think they're interested. I think it's how they prioritize the issues, which it comes back to the economy and jobs, healthcare, things that have really just drowned out the discussion about environmental standards. But no, I'm very surprised to hear that data, and I think it's a good thing. So I stand corrected.
I agree with Alex. I feel like people, obviously it's like icing on the cake if you're, I doubt there's anyone who's in favor of more pollution for the sake of pollution. I mean, even the Republican Party platform, which I was looking over again this morning, talks about privatized environmentalism. Both parties have similar stances on the environment, but I think it just differs in how they approach the issue. So I do agree with Alex, though, that stopping global warming is not going to put bread on the table. It's not going to pay your electricity bill. Stopping global warming is not a priority to people, as are other issues. But I mean, obviously for voters, it would be everybody prioritizes differently. But to a majority of voters, I think that they're obviously going to support a candidate who is environmentally friendly. And both platforms touch on that to different degrees.
Comments, questions? Yes.
David Gassman, I'm a PhD student at Price. So my question is, are we maybe a little bit too ambitious in thinking that we can deal with climate change as a comprehensive issue? And is it kind of akin to something like poverty in that we're going to have to pass lots of different pieces of legislation to get at lots of dimensions of the issue? And so a lot of what goes on might not be seen as being addressing the issue adequately, but that it's not possible to have a California comprehensive strategy on an issue that's as complex as climate change.
Yeah, since you mentioned California, a very quick comment back to David, which is actually California does have a complex array of different policies for which AB 32 is only one to address the issues of emissions, fossil fuel, energy, and so forth. In fact, something like 45% of the reductions that are demanded in the climate change policy are captured in our clean air policy, in our fuel efficiency policy, in our urban design policy. So actually California does have a matrix of policies, many of which reinforce one another with the result of reducing greenhouse gas emissions, even if some of them were for other reasons, such as the South Coast Air Quality Management's ambient air quality strategy that is for our own region. So we actually, you're right, and it is happening in California, just didn't have time for the whole lecture. Yes, sir.
Hello, I'm Tomas Chanet. I'm PhD in biomedical engineering. There was a question if US should be unilateral in the world, but actually if we look about the European Union is already doing their own unilateral political changes. And if we look about Europe, there is a right wing all in power around the Europe. And we can just join and play together, but why, it's the question, doing it or not, I think it's the cost of action. You already mentioned that all the Californians will pay out of their pocket, and when there is no budget, no money, it's hard to do investment. But on the other side, if we look about Austria, for example, Austria has a population of 8 million. They decided, right-wing government, that they will invest in green jobs, and they created 100,000 green jobs in a couple of years, and the investment is already paying off. So this is also opportunity for job creation, but of course at the start you need investment, huge investment of money. So I think here is the question, does US policy state has the money to invest in it with all those, when we talk about healthcare, army forces budget, and how to close that gap that's already in the budget?
I think you've answered your own question, but it was a good statement, which is this requires upfront investment, and some countries and some communities have made that investment. California is making that investment, but it's a very difficult hurdle when you have these issues of uncertainty, whether correct or not in terms of the science, the public perception of uncertainty and the political perception of uncertainty, and then the direct costs. By the way, AB 32 was passed not simply to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, but to cultivate that kind of industry in California. We have a zero emission highway. We have a lot of investments in California that are supposed to bring business in. One of the biggest debates in the United States about this recently has been over solar, the development and manufacturing of solar facilities. And what's happened is the Germans have the best solar technology, the Chinese have the best solar production, and California has the best market for selling, or purchasing rather, solar. So we are purchasing and we're not keeping the jobs here, except for the installation jobs and some of the technology. So it's not always clear the winners and losers when you say we're going down this green energy path. It's just a difficult situation we're in. But you're right, who can afford and who's willing to pay up front? Did you have your hand up a second ago, Juliana?
Yeah, I guess I want to come back to this issue of uncertainty and how that may affect policy. Just from a risk management perspective, right? So a lot of things in life there's uncertainty, right? We buy car insurance, right? We don't know when we'll get into an accident. You know, it doesn't. The fact that we don't know the probability, you know, of an accident doesn't prevent us from buying car insurance. So I think uncertainty itself does call for policy action, and also maybe the fact that we do need more funding for research, R&D to understand this issue a little bit better. I think that's a policy in itself. So more funding for scientific research and policy research in this area. And I guess going back to the question just now, a lot of countries are looking into, you know, turning this quote unquote crisis into an opportunity, right? To see if we can, you know, have the structure of the economy. I think China is actually trying to do this, to invest in some of these green sectors and as a means also to boost the economy. So I think development and environmental issues sometimes, you know, they can go hand in hand.
You mentioned China, and I did ask Juliana to say a word about China. Is there more you'd like to tell us about what the Chinese are doing?
Sure. So China, because of the planning tradition, so every 5 years, the central planners put out a 5-year plan. So climate change has actually entered into the 5-year plans of the Chinese government. So that is a very clear sign that the government is thinking very seriously about the issue. So energy efficiency, demand side management, new technology. So the government is investing a lot in R&D and in strategic sectors. So solar is one sector the government has favorable policies in. And they're also doing some pilot programs on trading, emissions trading, try to see if they can use market forces to reduce the cost of achieving the goals. So I think China is doing a lot, but of course, because it is a country that's growing so rapidly, right now the Chinese government's official commitment is on reducing carbon intensity and not in terms of the absolute emissions.
Which, if I may just pick up on that last comment, which is carbon intensity means you're using it more efficiently, but that doesn't mean your aggregate emissions don't continue to rise, which is China's and the U.S.'s situation. So, if you will, one little way of thinking about this is a foot race. The foot race is, can we reduce the emissions quick enough and rapidly enough to avoid the temperature rising too far beyond reasonable, manageable bounds for the human population on the planet? And it's just a foot race. And we are in that foot race right now. And so the competition.
Dan, I want to say thank you very much, all of you, because this is a very, very important discussion with great information shared. But I did want to clear up something that might be a misconception I don't want this group left with.
Fire away.
Having been the senior advisor to Governor Schwarzenegger involved in the negotiations with AB 32 and a lot of our other leading environmental regulations, it is not true that good environmental policy necessarily costs government more money or people more money. And I'll just give a few examples of that. When California said we're going to regulate tailpipe emission standards of the car companies, that's saying to the car companies, and when you're California of the United States, you have a big enough market that you can do this. You say to the car companies, if you want to sell cars in California, and we do, you cannot sell them unless they meet certain standards. That costs the state nothing to make a policy that then has the car industry, which is very interested in selling in California, do to meet those standards. That's one example. Another example is that up until forever, state governments and our national government have not taken into consideration the health and other costs that the state pays, not to mention families and individuals pay, by not regulating some of these items. So the state, cities, counties cost a lot of money in the health costs, separate from climate change, air regulation is asthma and other respiratory diseases. So we have to offset that as well. So I just wanted to be clear that and on top of that, California has shown the country that over the past 15 years, because of the most intelligent energy efficiency plans, that we were able to increase productivity statewide while decreasing energy use just through energy efficiency, which saves cities and the state government money, but also saves individuals we know in our own home. If you're not leaving if you don't do the washing machine as often or don't leave all your lights on, you're not only helping the environment and climate change, you're saving your family money. So I just wanted to be on the record clear that cities, states, nations with smart and environmental policies do not often cost more money, just the opposite.
I think that's well said. I think that there are two parts of that you mentioned. One is the actual cost out of pocket, and it was comment about the capital cost may be the barrier, not the ongoing cost, which is how do you start this process of transitioning? And that does cost money. Someone's going to pay for it.
And even that, there's exciting developments like, for example, private equity firms are moving in and investing in San Diego. There's a solar company that's going to public schools in San Diego and saying, listen, we'll pay to put solar panels on. You have to just enter into a 30-year power purchase agreement from us. You'll pay less each month than you do to your local utility, but you're paying it to us and you'll save money. But in the end, we're going to end up making money, so we'll finance the upfront. So even that, there's creative things happening with the right policies.
You're absolutely right on that. But the other was actually, if I want to come back to it, which is not in the same ledger. There's benefits over here, not insignificant, like in health, when you clean the air, and that's a local area, and that's very true for Los Angeles and Southern California. That's a driver for the South Coast Air Quality Management District in regulating the region. That's not quite the same with climate change, however, because it's a global phenomenon. So the cost bearers are going to be those island nation states and people elsewhere on the planet who may not be as well equipped to shield themselves from the effects or to protect themselves from the effects. So it's a distributional phenomenon. It's global now rather than just local. So that changes the calculus in some people's minds. I'm watching the clock. I'm going to call it to close because we stop at 1, but I hope you have a sense that this should be an issue on the campaign agenda. With that, we'll close for the road to the White House. Thank the panel. Juliana, Charles, Alex.